The wind carried the scent of snow down from the peaks, and Michelle Carter knew she had perhaps 3 days before the first real storm of winter would trap her on this mountain with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that had driven her this far. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching smoke rise from the chimney of the cabin that represented her last chance at survival, her fingers numb inside her threadbare gloves as she clutched the leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world. The cabin sat like a fortress against the wilderness, built from logs that had weathered decades of mountain storms, its windows glowing amber in the gathering dusk. She had walked for 2 days to reach this place, following directions given by a shopkeeper in the valley town who had looked at her with a mixture of pity and doubt when she asked about work on the mountain. Justin Gonzalez, he had called the man who lived here, a name spoken with respect and wariness in equal measure. A man who kept to himself and asked nothing of the world below. Michelle's stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion these past weeks since the bank had taken her small farm and left her with nothing but debt, and the bitter knowledge that her husband's gambling had destroyed more than just their marriage before his death. She had tried to find work in town, had knocked on every door and pleaded for any opportunity to earn her keep. But winter was coming and no one wanted to take on a woman with no family and no references except the word of creditors who spoke her name like a curse. The path to the cabin was worn but not well traveled, winding between pine trees that creaked in the wind like old bones. As she walked closer, she could see a man moving behind the lit windows, his silhouette broad and purposeful. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not just from the altitude and exertion, but from the knowledge that this moment would determine whether she lived through the winter or became another casualty of the mountains. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. She had rehearsed her words during the long walk, practiced the tone that would convey desperation without begging, competence without presumption. She needed him to see her as useful, not as a burden. The wind picked up, sending her dark hair whipping across her face as she approached the heavy wooden door. She could hear movement inside, the scrape of a chair, the thud of boots on floorboards. Her knock echoed in the stillness, 3 firm raps that seemed to hang in the air like a question. The sounds inside the cabin ceased. She waited, counting her heartbeats, feeling the cold seep through her worn coat. When the door finally opened, she found herself looking up at a man who filled the doorframe like he had been carved from the mountain itself. Justin Gonzalez stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years spent splitting wood and hauling stone. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her travel-stained clothes and the determined set of her chin, before his gaze settled on her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of his heritage and the careful cadence of a man who chose his words with precision. "I'm looking for work," Michelle replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend animals. I'm not afraid of hard labor, and I won't be any trouble." Something flickered in his expression, too quick to read. "There's no work here for a woman. You should head back down the mountain before the weather turns." "I can't." The words came out more forcefully than she intended, and she saw his eyebrows raise slightly. "I mean, I have nowhere else to go. I can work for just food and shelter, nothing more. I know how to preserve meat, how to make soap from ash and fat, how to patch roof leaks and chink walls against the cold. I grew up on a farm. I know what winter requires." He leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed over his chest, and she could see him weighing her words against some internal calculation. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind in the pines and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to let him see the determination that had carried her up this mountain and the quiet desperation that would not let her turn back. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Michelle Carter." "You have family, Michelle Carter?" The question hit like a physical blow, but she kept her expression steady. No family." He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The nearest neighbor is 15 miles down the mountain. The snow will be deep by December and won't clear until April. You understand what that means? It means I'll earn my keep or die trying. For the first time, she saw something that might have been the ghost of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. He stepped back from the doorway, and she felt a surge of hope that was quickly tempered by his next words. I don't need help with cooking or cleaning. I've been taking care of myself for longer than you've been alive, most likely. He paused, studying her face in the lamplight that spilled from inside the cabin. But I could use help with the animals before the snow gets too deep. There's a lean-to on the back of the cabin, big enough for a bedroll and not much else. You can sleep there if you're willing to work for it. Michelle felt her knees go weak with relief, but before she could speak, he held up a hand. But understand this, Mrs. Carter. This isn't charity, and it isn't kindness. You'll work harder than you've ever worked in your life, and if you can't pull your weight, you'll find yourself walking back down this mountain, regardless of the weather. I won't have someone depending on me who can't depend on themselves. I understand, she said, though she wasn't entirely certain she did. There was something in his tone, something that suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface of his words. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The cabin's interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows on the log walls. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted, each piece showing the attention to detail of someone who took pride in his work. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books whose leather spines gleamed in the firelight. You can put your things there, he said, nodding toward a corner near the door. I'll show you where you'll be sleeping. He led her through the cabin and out a back door to a small structure that was indeed little more than a lean-to, though it was solidly built and appeared weatherproof. A narrow cot stood against one wall with hooks for hanging clothes and a small wooden chest for storage. It was sparse but clean, and Michelle had slept in far worse places during her journey to reach this mountain. There's a privy about 50 yards that way, Justin said, pointing into the darkness. Water comes from the well by the front porch. You'll help me tend the animals at dawn and dusk, and during the day you'll help me prepare for winter. Cutting wood, checking the roof, making sure we have enough supplies to last until spring. What animals, she asked. Goats, chickens, a milk cow. Nothing fancy, but they need daily care. He paused, looking at her in the dim light that filtered from the cabin's windows. You ever milked a cow? Yes. Good. We'll start tomorrow. For tonight, get some rest. Dawn comes early up here. He turned to go back inside, then stopped. There's bread and cold meat on the table if you're hungry. Help yourself. Michelle felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from relief or gratitude or simple exhaustion, she couldn't say. Thank you. He paused in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the warm light from inside. Don't thank me yet. Wait and see if you still feel that way come spring. Alone in the small shelter, Michelle unpacked her few belongings with hands that shook slightly from cold and reaction. She had done it. She had found shelter for the winter. Found work that would keep her fed and housed until the snow melted, and she could figure out what came next. But as she spread her thin blanket on the narrow cot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far more complicated than a simple arrangement for winter work. The man, Justin, was not what she had expected. There was an intelligence in his eyes that spoke of education, a precision in his speech that suggested he had not always lived alone on this mountain. The books on his shelves, the quality of his furniture, the way he had studied her as if reading a language he knew well, all pointed to depths she had not anticipated. She made her way back to the cabin, where she found the promised food waiting on the rough-hewn table. The bread was fresh-baked and still soft, the meat tender and well-seasoned. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while she studied her surroundings more carefully. The cabin was the work of someone who understood both craftsmanship and comfort, with details that spoke of years of patient improvement. Hand-carved wooden bowls sat on open shelves, their surfaces smooth with use and care. A rifle hung over the fireplace, its metal gleaming with oil and attention. You're wondering who I am, Justin said from the doorway, and Michelle started, not having heard him approach. I'm wondering why you live alone up here, she admitted. He moved to the fireplace, adding a log to the flames before settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. Same reason you're running from whatever you're running from. Sometimes the world below gets to be too much. Michelle set down her piece of bread, studying his profile in the firelight. I'm not running from anything. I'm running to something. Survival. Same thing sometimes. He looked at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her think he understood more about desperation than his comfortable cabin might suggest. What happened to your husband? The question was asked quietly, without judgment, but it still hit like a physical blow. He died 6 months ago, left me with debts I couldn't pay, and land the bank was happy to take. I'm sorry. The simple words, spoken without pity or false comfort, somehow meant more than all the elaborate condolences she had received from neighbors who had watched her fall with the satisfied attention of people observing a cautionary tale. Were you married? She asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry. That's not my business. No, he said simply. Never married. Something in his tone suggested the topic was closed, and Michelle returned her attention to her food. The silence that fell between them was not uncomfortable, but it was weighted with the awareness that they were two strangers who would be sharing this isolated space for the next several months, dependent on each other in ways that neither had fully considered. The work will be hard, Justin said eventually. Harder than you might expect. The altitude makes everything more difficult, and the cold can be brutal. If you have any doubts about your ability to handle it, now would be the time to speak up. Michelle met his gaze steadily. I don't have the luxury of doubts. He nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. Fair enough. We'll see how you feel after a few days of splitting wood and hauling water. She finished her meal in silence, acutely aware of his presence across the room. He had returned to his book, but she could feel his attention on her, assessing and measuring in a way that made her self-conscious. When she rose to clear her dishes, he looked up. Leave them. I'll take care of it. I can clean up after myself. I'm sure you can, but tonight you're tired, and tomorrow will come early enough. He stood, moving with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own space. Get some rest. I'll wake you at sunrise. Michelle made her way back to the lean-to, where the temperature had already begun to drop with the setting sun. She wrapped herself in her blanket and lay on the narrow cot, listening to the sounds of the mountain night. Wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the crack and settle of cooling wood. From the cabin came the soft sounds of Justin moving about, banking the fire, preparing for sleep. She had expected to lie awake, her mind churning with questions and worries about the arrangement she had just entered into. Instead, for the first time in weeks, she felt the deep relaxation that came with knowing she had a roof over her head and food in her stomach. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she would face them from a position of relative security. But as she drifted towards sleep, she found herself thinking about the way Justin had looked at her, the careful distance he maintained even while offering help. There had been something in his eyes, a recognition that suggested he saw more than just a desperate woman looking for work. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with an unease she couldn't quite name. She woke to the sound of someone moving around outside the lean-to, and for a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or why she was sleeping on a narrow cot instead of in her own bed. Then memory flooded back, along with the pale gray light of dawn filtering through the single small window. Mrs. Carter, Justin's voice came from outside the door. Time to get started. Michelle sat up, her body protesting the unfamiliar sleeping arrangements. I'll be right there. She dressed quickly in the dim light, grateful for the heavy wool dress that would provide warmth during the day's work. When she stepped outside, she found Justin waiting with 2 steaming cups in his hands. Coffee, he said, offering her one. You'll need it. The coffee was strong and black, with a bitter edge that helped clear the fog of sleep from her mind. Justin was already dressed for work, wearing heavy boots and a coat that had seen many winters. In the early morning light, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 40, with a kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work. The animals are this way, he said, leading her toward a cluster of small buildings she hadn't noticed in the darkness the night before. The goats were housed in a sturdy pen with a 3-sided shelter, a small herd of mixed breeds that bleated their displeasure at being disturbed so early. The chickens occupied a well-built coop with nesting boxes and a secure run, while the cow had her own small barn with a stall and milking area. The routine is simple, Justin explained as he demonstrated the morning feeding. Goats get hay and grain, chickens get scratch and whatever scraps we have from the kitchen. The cow gets hay and grain, and she needs to be milked twice a day. Michelle watched carefully, noting the amounts and the order of tasks. She had indeed grown up on a farm, but it had been a small operation, nothing like the efficient setup Justin had created here. Everything was organized for maximum efficiency with minimum waste. The work of someone who understood that mistakes in an isolated location could have serious consequences. "You'll handle the chickens and the cow," he said. "I'll take care of the goats for now, until you get used to the routine." The cow was a placid Holstein mix who stood patiently while Michelle reacquainted herself with the rhythm of milking. Her hands were stiff from the cold, but the familiar motion came back quickly, and soon she had a bucket of warm, foamy milk. "Not bad," Justin said, appearing at her shoulder with a nod of approval. "She's a good milker, but she can be temperamental if she doesn't like you." "Animals usually like me," Michelle replied, scratching the cow behind the ears. "That's good. We depend on them up here." They worked in comfortable silence, moving through the morning chores with the kind of efficiency that would become my routine over the coming months. When they finished, Justin led her back to the cabin, where he prepared a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits that filled the small space with warmth and the promise of a day's work ahead. "After we eat, we'll start on the wood," he said. "I've got trees marked for cutting, but they need to be felled, sectioned, and split before the snow gets too deep." Michelle nodded, though the prospect of tree felling was daunting. She had split kindling and stacked cordwood, but she had never actually cut down a tree. "I'll teach you," Justin said, as if reading her thoughts. "It's not as hard as it looks, but it requires attention. A mistake with an axe or a saw can be fatal, especially when you're miles from help." The casual mention of death sent a chill through Michelle that had nothing to do with the morning air. She was truly isolated here, dependent on this man she barely knew for not just shelter and food, but for her very survival. If something happened to him, if he decided he no longer wanted her here, she would have nowhere to go and no way to survive the winter alone. As if sensing her thoughts, Justin looked at her across the table. "Having second thoughts?" "No," she said, though her voice sounded less certain than she would have liked. "Good, because once the snow starts, there's no changing your mind." After breakfast, Justin led her to a stand of pine trees about a quarter-mile from the cabin, where several had been marked with slashes of red paint. The trees were substantial, their trunks easily 2 feet in diameter, and Michelle felt a flutter of apprehension as she watched Justin examine the first one they would fell. "The key is reading the tree," he explained, running his hands over the bark and studying the crown high above. "You have to know which way it wants to fall, and then make sure that's the way it goes." He showed her how to make the initial cut, the careful notch that would guide the tree's fall, then the back cut that would send it crashing down. The work was physically demanding, requiring not just strength but precision and timing. Michelle watched closely, noting the way he positioned himself, the rhythm of his movements, the constant awareness of escape routes should something go wrong. When the first tree crashed down with a thunderous roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks, Michelle felt a surge of exhilaration mixed with fear. The raw power involved in bringing down something that had stood for decades was both thrilling and sobering. "Your turn," Justin said, offering her the axe. The tool was heavier than she had expected, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Under Justin's patient instruction, she began to work on the next marked tree, her movements awkward at first but gradually finding their rhythm. The work was exhausting, each swing requiring her full strength and attention. But there was something deeply satisfying about the solid thunk of steel biting into wood. "Not bad," Justin said when she had completed her first notch. "You've got good instincts." The praise warmed her more than it should have, and she found herself working with renewed energy. They spent the morning felling trees, the physical labor demanding but oddly meditative. There was something about the repetitive motion, the focus required, that pushed all other thoughts from her mind. By midday, They had dropped 6 trees and begun the process of sectioning them into manageable lengths. Michelle's hands were blistered despite her gloves, and her shoulders ached from the unaccustomed work. But she felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to admit. "We'll break for lunch," Justin said, noting her fatigue. "This afternoon we'll start splitting." They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence, the morning's work having established a rhythm between them. Michelle found herself studying Justin's profile as they walked, noting the way he moved through the forest with the confidence of someone completely at home in this environment. There was something almost elemental about him, as if he had grown from the mountain itself. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as they approached the cabin. "8 years," he replied. "Built most of it myself." "What did you do before?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then just as they reached the porch, he said, "I was a teacher, down in Denver." The revelation surprised her. She could see it now, the intelligence she had noted, the patience he had shown in instructing her, the careful way he chose his words. "What did you teach?" "Literature, poetry." He opened the cabin door, holding it for her to pass through. "Seems like another lifetime now." Michelle wanted to ask what had driven him from that life to this isolated existence, but something in his tone warned her away from the subject. Instead, she helped him prepare a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and preserved meat, the domestic routine feeling surprisingly natural despite the newness of their arrangement. As they ate, she found herself studying the books on his shelves with new interest. She could see volumes of Shakespeare, Whitman, Frost, their spines worn with handling. The incongruity of finding such a library in this remote cabin struck her anew. "You're welcome to borrow any of them," Justin said, following her gaze. "I'd like that. It's been a long time since I had access to books." "What do you like to read?" "Anything, really. But I've always been partial to stories about people finding their way through difficult circumstances." Something flickered in his expression, too quick to interpret. "You'll find plenty of those on those shelves." They returned to work after lunch, and Michelle learned the art of splitting wood, the way to read the grain and place the wedge for maximum efficiency. Her technique was clumsy at first, but under Justin's patient instruction, she began to develop a rhythm. The work was hard, but there was something deeply satisfying about reducing the fallen trees to neat stacks of split wood that would keep them warm through the winter. As the afternoon wore on, Michelle became aware of a change in the weather. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow, and the temperature was dropping noticeably. Justin noticed it too, his movements becoming more urgent as he worked. "Storm coming," he said, pausing to study the darkening sky. "Probably hit tonight or tomorrow morning." "Is that bad?" "Depends on how much snow we get. If it's heavy, we could be snowed in for days." He looked at her seriously. "Still time to change your mind and head down the mountain." Michelle looked at the stacks of wood they had accumulated, at the cabin that promised warmth and shelter, at this man who had offered her a chance when no one else would. "I'm staying." He nodded as if he had expected no other answer. "Then we'd better get this wood under cover." They worked with increased urgency as the first snowflakes began to fall, large, wet flakes that clung to their clothes and melted on their faces. By the time they had stacked the last of the split wood under the shelter of the cabin's extended eaves, the snow was falling steadily, transforming the landscape into something magical and ominous. "That's enough for today," Justin said, brushing snow from his hair. "We'll do the evening chores and then get inside." The animals seemed to sense the approaching storm, the goats huddling together in their shelter, while the chickens stayed close to their coop. The cow lowed softly as Michelle milked her, as if seeking comfort in the familiar routine. By the time they finished, the snow was falling heavily, already beginning to accumulate on the ground. Inside the cabin, Justin built up the fire while Michelle prepared a simple dinner from their supplies. The domestic scene felt surreal after the day's hard labor, but there was something comforting about the routine, the sense of working together toward a common goal. "How bad do you think it will be?" Michelle asked as they sat down to eat. "Hard to say. Could be just a dusting, could be the start of winter." He looked out the window at the swirling snow. "Either way, we're committed now." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had fully explored. They were committed, bound together by circumstance and necessity for the duration of the winter, two strangers who would have to learn to trust each other or face the consequences of isolation and conflict. As if reading her thoughts, Justin said, "We need to establish some ground rules, boundaries." Michelle felt her stomach tighten. What kind of boundaries? Simple ones. Privacy, respect, shared responsibilities. He paused, meeting her eyes across the table. "We're going to be living in close quarters for months. We need to be clear about expectations." "I understand." "Do you?" His gaze was steady, searching. "Because there's something I need you to understand, Mrs. Carter. I didn't invite you to stay here out of kindness or charity. I did it because I could see you're strong enough to pull your weight and smart enough not to cause problems. But if that changes, if you become more trouble than you're worth, you'll find yourself outside regardless of the weather." The words were spoken quietly, without heat, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. Michelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "And what about you?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What assurance do I have that you'll honor our agreement?" For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes, and Michelle realized she might have pushed too far. Then unexpectedly he smiled. "Fair question. I suppose you don't have any assurance except my word. Then I'll have to trust your word. And I'll have to trust that you meant what you said about being able to handle the work and the isolation." They finished their meal in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind was picking up, driving the snow against the windows with increasing force. Michelle helped clean up after dinner, then excused herself to her small shelter, where she lay listening to the storm and wondering what she had gotten herself into. The lean-to was surprisingly warm, insulated by the main cabin, and heated by the residual warmth from the day's fire. But as she lay in the narrow bed, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed some invisible threshold pause. That whatever happened next would change her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The storm raged through the night, and when she woke the next morning, the world outside had been transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the clearing, and more was still falling. When Justin knocked on her door, his expression was grim. "We've got problems," he said without preamble. "The storm knocked a tree down across the path to the animals. We need to clear it before we can get to them." Michelle dressed quickly and followed him outside, where the full force of the storm hit her like a physical blow. The wind was fierce, driving snow that stung her face and made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The fallen tree was massive, its trunk blocking the narrow path completely. "We'll have to cut it up and move it piece by piece," Justin shouted over the wind. "It's going to take hours." They worked in brutal conditions, taking turns with the saw while the other tried to stay warm. Michelle's hands went numb despite her gloves, and she could feel ice forming in her hair and eyebrows. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the animals were depending on them and that failure was not an option. By the time they cleared the path, they were both exhausted and half frozen. The animals were distressed but unharmed, huddled together for warmth in their shelters. As they completed the morning chores, Michelle realized that this was just the beginning, that the winter would bring many such challenges, each one a test of their ability to work together and survive. "Still glad you stayed?" Justin asked as they made their way back to the cabin. "Ask me again in the spring," Michelle replied, but she was surprised to realize that despite the hardship, despite the uncertainty, she was indeed glad to be here. That evening, as they sat by the fire recovering from the day's ordeal, Justin looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You did good work today," he said simply. "So did you." He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I should tell you something, Mrs. Carter, about why I'm up here." Michelle felt her pulse quicken. "You don't owe me any explanations." "Maybe not, but if we're going to make it through the winter, we need to understand each other." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I left Denver because of a scandal. A student accused me of improper conduct. The charges were false, but the damage was done. I lost my position, my reputation, everything I had worked for." The revelation hung in the air between them, and Michelle felt the weight of his trust in sharing it. "I'm sorry that happened to you. The point is, I know what it's like to lose everything, to have nowhere to turn. That's why I said yes when you asked for help. He paused, his eyes reflecting the firelight. But it's also why I need you to understand that up here, we depend on each other completely. There's no room for doubt or mistrust. Michelle nodded, understanding more than he might have realized. I won't let you down. See that you don't, he said, but his tone had lost its edge. Because come morning, that storm will still be out there, and we'll have to face it together. As if summoned by his words, a tremendous gust of wind shook the cabin, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling down the chimney to hiss against the flames. Michelle looked toward the door where she could hear the storm clawing at the wood like some wild thing trying to get in. How long do these storms usually last? She asked. Justin's expression grew troubled as he listened to the wind. This one sounds different, stronger than usual. He stood and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling darkness. I've seen storms that lasted a week, sometimes more. A week. The thought sent a chill through Michelle that had nothing to do with the cold. A week trapped in this small space with a man she barely knew, dependent on their supplies and their ability to work together. She was beginning to understand just how isolated they truly were, how completely cut off from any help or rescue. The animals will need extra care, Justin continued, still watching the storm. If the temperature drops much more, we could lose them. What can we do? Pray the storm passes quickly. He turned from the window, his face grave, and prepare for the possibility that it won't. The storm that had seemed fierce the night before revealed its true fury with the dawn. Michelle woke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural, broken only by the occasional groan of the cabin's timbers under the weight of accumulated snow. When she peered through the small window of her lean-to, she saw nothing but white, a wall of snow that had drifted nearly to the roofline during the night. Justin's knock came earlier than usual, sharp and urgent. Mrs. Carter, we have a situation. She dressed quickly, her breath visible in the frigid air of the small shelter. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and frost covered every surface inside the lean-to despite the proximity to the main cabin. When she opened the door, she found Justin standing in snow that reached past his knees, his face grim with concern. The animals, he said without preamble, I can't get to them. The snow's too deep, and there's more coming. Michelle looked toward where she knew the animal shelter stood, but could see nothing except an unbroken expanse of white. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile, erasing all the landmarks she had begun to recognize. What do we do? We dig, Justin replied, already turning toward the cabin. But first, we need to make sure we don't lose the cabin itself. The snow load on the roof is getting dangerous. They spent the morning hours in back-breaking labor, Justin climbing onto the cabin roof with a shovel, while Michelle worked to clear snow from around the foundation and the doorways. The physical effort was exhausting at the high altitude, and the cold was so intense it seemed to burn her lungs with each breath. But the alternative, being trapped or crushed by the weight of snow, drove them to continue despite their exhaustion. By midday, they had managed to clear a narrow path to the animal shelters, where they found the goats huddled together in obvious distress. The chickens had survived the night, but their water had frozen solid, and several of the birds showed signs of frostbite on their combs. The cow had fared better in her more substantial shelter, but she lowed plaintively when she saw them, clearly hungry and anxious. We'll have to bring them closer to the cabin, Justin said, studying the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had faced such emergencies before. If this storm keeps up, we won't be able to reach them at all. Where can we put them? There's a root cellar under the cabin, accessible from inside. It's not ideal, but it's warm and dry now. He paused, looking at the animals with something approaching affection. Better than losing them to the cold. The process of moving the animals was arduous and time-consuming. The goats had to be carried one by one through the deep snow, bleeding their displeasure at being handled. The chickens were easier to transport in their wooden crates. But the cow presented a significant challenge. She was too large to carry and too frightened by the unfamiliar conditions to cooperate willingly. We'll have to lead her, Justin decided, clear a path and hope she follows. It took them the better part of 2 hours to coax the reluctant cow through the snow to the cabin, where they discovered that getting her down the narrow stairs to the root cellar was nearly impossible. In the end, they had to create a makeshift ramp using boards from the woodpile, a process that left them both exhausted and frustrated. "This can't last much longer," Michelle said, as they finally secured the last of the animals in their temporary quarters beneath the cabin. Justin's expression was troubled as he looked out at the continuing snowfall. "I've never seen a storm like this one. The snow's already deeper than most entire winters." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, the wind began to howl with renewed fury. The sound was unlike anything Michelle had ever heard, a sustained shriek that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The cabin shook under the assault, and she found herself glancing nervously at the windows, half expecting to see them shatter under the pressure. "The temperature's still dropping," Justin observed, checking the thermometer that hung outside the kitchen window. 20 below and falling. Michelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had grown up in harsh winters, but nothing had prepared her for the brutal reality of mountain weather. The isolation that had seemed merely inconvenient now felt genuinely dangerous. "How long can we last if the storm doesn't break?" Justin was quiet for a long moment, calculating. "We have enough food for several weeks, assuming we're careful with portions. Firewood will be the real problem. What we have under cover will last maybe 10 days if we're conservative. And after that, we burn furniture, books, whatever we have to." His tone was matter of fact, but Michelle could see the worry in his eyes. "But it won't come to that. No storm lasts forever." Despite his reassurances, Michelle spent a restless night listening to the wind and wondering if they had made a terrible mistake in not attempting to leave the mountain when they still could. The lean-to, which had seemed adequately warm before, now felt like a fragile barrier against the killing cold outside. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and still shivered uncontrollably. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified, and when Justin attempted to open the cabin door, he found it blocked by a wall of snow that had drifted against the entrance during the night. "We're snowed in completely," he announced, his voice carefully controlled. "The door won't budge." Michelle felt a flutter of panic in her chest. "What about the windows?" "Too high off the ground and too small to be useful." He moved to the fireplace, adding wood with economical movements. "We'll have to wait for a break in the weather to dig ourselves out." The reality of their situation settled over them like a weight. They were truly trapped now, dependent entirely on their supplies and their ability to maintain the fire that was their only source of heat. The animals in the root cellar added an extra burden, requiring food and water that further strained their resources. As the day wore on, Michelle found herself studying Justin with new attention. The easy confidence he had displayed before was still there, but she could see the strain beginning to show in the tight lines around his eyes, the way he checked and rechecked their supplies with increasing frequency. The responsibility of keeping them both alive was wearing on him, and she realized that despite his competence, he was as vulnerable to the mountain's fury as she was. "Tell me about Denver," she said that evening, partly to distract herself from their circumstances, and partly because she genuinely wanted to understand the man she was depending on for survival. Justin looked up from the book he had been reading by firelight, surprised by the question. "What do you want to know?" "What was it like, teaching? Before the trouble, I mean." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the flames, he began to speak. "I loved it. The students, most of them anyway. There's something about watching a young mind discover poetry for the first time, seeing them understand that words can be more than just communication." "What kind of poetry did you teach?" "All kinds, but I was partial to the American poets. Whitman, Dickinson, Frost. Writers who understood the relationship between the land and the human spirit." He gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall. "Living up here, I understand their work in ways I never did in the city." Michelle found herself drawn into his words, forgetting for a moment the danger of their situation. "Do you miss it, the teaching?" "Sometimes." He looked at her then, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "But I've learned that some doors, once closed, can't be opened again. You have to find new ways forward." "Is that what you're doing up here, finding a new way forward?" "I thought I was, until you showed up and complicated everything." The words were spoken without heat, but they hit Michelle like a physical blow. I'm sorry, I never meant to be a burden. You're not a burden, Justin said quickly. That's not what I meant. He set down his book, giving her his full attention. What I mean is that living alone, you can convince yourself that solitude is enough, that you don't need connection with other people. But having you here, working beside you, depending on you and having you depend on me, it reminds me of what I gave up when I came to this mountain. Michelle felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition of the intimacy that their shared isolation had created. They were no longer simply two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They had become something else, bound by necessity and growing trust in ways that neither had anticipated. I know what you mean, she said softly. After my husband died, I thought I wanted to be alone too, that it would be easier than risking being hurt again. And now? Now I think maybe being alone isn't the same as being safe. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crack of burning wood and the endless howl of wind outside. Michelle found herself acutely aware of Justin's presence, the way the firelight played across his features, the quiet strength that radiated from him even in their current extremity. Mrs. Carter, he said eventually, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. Michelle, she corrected. I think we're past formalities. Michelle. He seemed to taste the name, and she felt an unexpected warmth at hearing it spoken in his deep voice. There's something I need to tell you about our situation. The seriousness of his expression sent a chill through her. What is it? The food situation is worse than I let on. With the animals to feed as well as ourselves, we have maybe a week of supplies left. Less if the storm doesn't break soon. Michelle felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. A week? Maybe 10 days if we're very careful. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But that's not the worst of it. If we can't get out to cut more wood soon, we'll start running low on fuel for the fire. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Without the fire, they would freeze to death in a matter of hours in these temperatures. The cabin that had seemed so solid and secure now felt as fragile as a house of cards. What can we do? We conserve everything. Food, wood, even body heat. He paused and she saw something flicker in his expression. Which brings me to something else we need to discuss. Michelle waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Your shelter out there, it's not insulated well enough for these temperatures. You're using too much energy just trying to stay warm. Energy we can't afford to waste. He met her eyes directly. You'll have to sleep in here, by the fire. The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither wanted to address directly. Michelle understood the practical necessity, but she also understood the danger it represented. They were already walking a knife's edge of propriety, two unmarried people living in close quarters. Sharing sleeping space would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I don't think that's appropriate, she said carefully. Appropriate doesn't matter if we're both dead, Justin replied bluntly. This isn't about propriety, Michelle. It's about survival. She knew he was right, but the thought of sleeping in the same room as this man, of being that vulnerable and exposed, terrified her in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. I understand your concerns, Justin continued, his voice gentler now. But I give you my word that you'll be safe. I'm not the kind of man who would take advantage of a desperate situation. Michelle studied his face in the firelight, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motive. What she saw was the same steady honesty that had convinced her to trust him with her life in the first place. All right, she said finally, but I keep my knife. For the first time in days, Justin smiled. I wouldn't expect anything less. That night, Michelle moved her few belongings into the main cabin, arranging her bedroll near the fireplace while Justin prepared his own sleeping area on the opposite side of the room. The domestic intimacy of the arrangement felt strange and charged, but she had to admit that the warmth from the fire was a blessed relief after the bone-deep cold of the lean-to. They maintained a careful distance as they prepared for sleep, both acutely aware of the changed dynamic between them. Michelle changed into her nightgown behind a makeshift screen of blankets, hyper-aware of Justin's presence just feet away. When she finally settled into her bedroll, she found herself listening to the sound of his breathing, the small movements he made as he settled for the night. Michelle, His voice came softly through the darkness. Yes? Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for giving me reason to. She lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the dying embers of the fire and thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a married woman with a home and a future that seemed secure. Now she was sleeping in a stranger's cabin, dependent on his protection and goodwill for her very survival. The transformation was so complete, it felt like she had become a different person entirely. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The woman she had been before, the one who had ignored her husband's gambling and made excuses for his failures, who had accepted diminishment as the price of security, that woman had been weak in ways she was only now beginning to understand. This new version of herself, forged by necessity and hardship, was stronger than she had ever imagined she could be. The storm continued for 3 more days, each one bringing new challenges and deepening their isolation. The snow piled higher against the cabin walls, and the temperature dropped to levels that made even brief trips to tend the animals in the root cellar an ordeal. They settled into a routine of careful conservation, measuring out food in small portions and feeding the fire just enough to maintain livable temperatures. On the 4th day, Michelle woke to an unfamiliar sound. Silence. The wind that had been their constant companion for nearly a week had finally stilled, and weak sunlight was filtering through the cabin windows for the first time in days. It's over, Justin said, already moving toward the door. The storm's broken. But when they attempted to open the door, they discovered that the snow had drifted so high against it that they were still effectively trapped. It took them the better part of the morning to dig their way out, working in shifts with their limited tools to create a tunnel through the packed snow. When they finally emerged into the brilliant sunshine, Michelle was stunned by the transformation of the landscape. The snow lay 6 feet deep across the clearing, and the familiar shapes of trees and outbuildings were buried beneath smooth white dunes. The world had been remade into something alien and beautiful, but also profoundly hostile to human survival. We need to get to the woodpile, Justin said, studying the situation with practiced eyes. And we need to check the roof again. All this snow, the cabin's carrying more weight than it was designed for. They spent the day in exhausting labor, digging paths through the deep snow and working to secure their shelter against further damage. The physical effort was enormous at the high altitude, and Michelle found herself gasping for breath after even simple tasks. But there was also something exhilarating about being outside again, about feeling sunlight on her face after days of confinement. As they worked, she found herself stealing glances at Justin, noting the way his breath steamed in the frigid air, the economical grace of his movements as he wielded the shovel. There was something different about him in the aftermath of the storm, a quiet intensity that she hadn't noticed before. When he caught her looking, their eyes met and held for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "We make a good team," he said simply. "Yes," Michelle replied, though she sensed he meant more than just their ability to work together. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing another carefully rationed meal, Justin brought up a subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "We need to talk about what happens when the snow melts," he said. Michelle felt her stomach tighten. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable, but hoping to postpone it as long as possible. "What do you mean?" "I mean that our arrangement was for the winter. Come spring, you'll be free to leave, to make your own way." He paused, staring into the flames. "The question is, what do you want to do?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. Michelle realized that somewhere during their shared ordeal, the idea of leaving had become less appealing than the idea of staying. But she also understood that whatever was developing between them was complicated by their circumstances, by the isolation and dependence that had thrown them together. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." "Well, you should. Spring will come whether we're ready or not, and you'll need to have a plan." There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that suggested he was holding back his own feelings on the subject. Michelle found herself studying his profile in the firelight, wondering what he was thinking, what he wanted her to say. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you stay here?" "This is my home now. I don't have anywhere else to go." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her then, and she saw something flicker in his expression, gone too quickly to interpret. No, I suppose it isn't. They were interrupted by a sound from outside, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Justin was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with an urgency that sent alarms shooting through Michelle's chest. What is it? Avalanche, he said grimly, peering out into the darkness. Somewhere up the mountain. The storm must have destabilized the snowpack. As if to emphasize his words, another rumble echoed through the night, closer this time. Michelle joined him at the window, where she could see nothing but darkness and the pale gleam of snow in the starlight. Are we in danger? Depends on how much snow comes down and where it goes. Justin moved away from the window, his expression troubled. We should be all right here. The cabin's positioned to avoid the main avalanche paths. But if a big one comes down, it could block the only way off this mountain. The implication hit Michelle like a physical blow. If the avalanche blocked their route down the mountain, they would be trapped here, not just for the winter, but potentially for months longer. Their carefully calculated supplies would run out long before they could hope for rescue. How likely is that? Hard to say. The snowpack is deeper than I've ever seen it, and the temperature changes from the storm could have made it unstable. He moved to check their supplies again, a gesture that had become automatic over the past few days. We'll know more in the morning. But morning brought news that was worse than either of them had feared. When they climbed to higher ground to survey their surroundings, they could see that a massive avalanche had indeed come down during the night, filling the narrow valley that contained the only practical route off the mountain. The slide had carried trees, boulders, and thousands of tons of snow, creating a barrier that would take weeks or even months to clear. We're cut off, Justin said quietly, stating the obvious. Michelle stared at the devastation below, feeling a mixture of fear and strange elation. They were trapped, truly and completely, thrown together by forces beyond their control. Whatever happened next, whatever developed between them, would happen in isolation from the judgment and expectations of the outside world. How long, she asked. Until the snow melts enough to make the valley passable again. Late spring at the earliest, maybe not until early summer. 3 or 4 more months. The thought should have terrified her, but instead Michelle found herself thinking about the nights they would spend by the fire, the work they would share, the gradual deepening of whatever was growing between them. We'll need to be even more careful with supplies, Justin continued, his mind already working on the practical implications. And we'll have to hope that no one else tries to come up here looking for us. Would anyone come looking? Eventually maybe, but not until spring, and not if they think we're dead. He looked at her seriously. Michelle, you need to understand what this means. We're completely on our own now. No rescue, no help, no way out until the mountain decides to let us go. She met his gaze steadily. I understand. Do you? Because this changes everything. We're not just sharing a cabin for the winter anymore. We're bound together until this snow melts, like it or not. And if I don't like it, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Then you'd better learn to like it, because there's no other choice now. The words hung between them, charged with implications that neither was ready to explore. Michelle felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, understanding that they had crossed another invisible threshold. Whatever happened next would happen in complete isolation, without the safety net of civilization or the possibility of escape. As they made their way back to the cabin, she found herself acutely aware of Justin's presence beside her, of the way his breath steamed in the cold air, of the quiet strength that radiated from him even in the face of their desperate circumstances. They were truly alone now, bound together by necessity and growing attraction in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. That night, as they prepared for sleep in their shared space by the fire, the tension between them was palpable. They moved around each other with careful precision, both aware that the rules of their arrangement had fundamentally changed. When Michelle caught Justin watching her as she brushed her hair, the intensity in his gaze sent heat flooding through her despite the cold. Justin, she said softly, not sure what she wanted to say, but needing to break the charged silence. I know, he replied, his voice rough with something she didn't dare name. I feel it too. The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. Michelle felt her heart racing as she realized they were approaching a point of no return, a moment that would change everything between them. But before either could speak again, a new sound reached them from outside. Voices, distant but unmistakably human, calling through the night air. Justin was on his feet instantly, his expression sharp with alarm. Someone's out there. Michelle felt her blood turn to ice. After days of complete isolation, the presence of other people should have been a relief. Instead, something in Justin's reaction told her that whoever was approaching through the snow meant danger, not rescue. Who could it be? I don't know, Justin replied grimly, already reaching for the rifle above the fireplace. But we're about to find out. The voices were getting closer now, and Michelle could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, all male, their words indistinct but their tone suggesting urgency or anger. Justin moved to the window, peering out into the darkness while keeping the rifle ready. Can you see them? Not yet, but they're heading this way, following our tracks from today. His jaw was tight with tension. Michelle, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If these men are who I think they might be, we could be in serious trouble. Who do you think they are? Men from town, maybe, or worse. He turned from the window, his expression grim. There are people down in the valley who know I'm up here, and not all of them wish me well. If word got out about the accusations that drove me from Denver, if someone decided to take justice into their own hands, the implication hit Michelle like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the immediate dangers of weather and isolation that she hadn't considered the possibility of human threats. But now, trapped on this mountain with nowhere to run, they were completely vulnerable to anyone who might wish Justin harm. What do? We wait and see what they want, but be ready to run if I tell you to. He checked the rifle's action, the metallic sounds sharp in the tense air. There's a back way out of the cabin, through the root cellar. If things go bad, you take that route and don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You will if I tell you to, Justin said firmly. This isn't about heroics, Michelle. It's about survival. The voices were close enough now that they could make out individual words, and what Michelle heard sent terror shooting through her veins. No, he's up here somewhere, one voice was saying. Tracks lead right to this clearing. Should have burned him out years ago, another replied. Man like that, no telling what he might do to a woman alone. Michelle felt Justin stiffen beside her. The men outside weren't just looking for him. They were hunting him, driven by rumors and suspicion into something that sounded dangerously like a lynch mob. How many? She whispered. At least 4, maybe more. Justin's voice was carefully controlled, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. They're armed, and they didn't come all the way up here in this weather just to talk. A heavy knock echoed through the cabin, followed by a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Gonzalez, we know you're in there. Come out and face what's coming to you. Justin moved to the door but didn't open it. What do you want, Benjamin? You know damn well what we want. Justice for what you did to that girl in Denver. I didn't do anything to anyone, and you know it. That's not what we heard. The voice belonged to someone else now, younger and angrier. Word is you had to run because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself. Michelle saw Justin's hands tighten on the rifle, his knuckles white with suppressed rage. She could only imagine how it felt to be accused of something so vile, to have his reputation destroyed by lies and innuendo. Christopher, Justin said, addressing the second speaker, you've known me for 8 years. Do you really believe I'm capable of what they're saying? I don't know what to believe anymore, came the reply. All I know is you ran, and guilty men run. I ran because there was no point in staying to be destroyed by lies. Then prove it, the first voice, Benjamin, called out. Come out here and face us like a man. So you can string me up without a trial? I don't think so. Michelle heard the sound of movement outside, boots crunching in the snow as the men spread out around the cabin. They were surrounding the building, cutting off any chance of escape. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized they were truly trapped. We found tracks, another voice called out. Fresh ones leading to this cabin. You got someone in there with you, Gonzalez? Justin's expression went deadly still. That's none of your business. It is if you've got another victim in there. The malice in the voice was unmistakable. We heard a woman went missing from town a few weeks back. Widow named Carter. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. They thought Justin had kidnapped her, or worse. The situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. Mrs. Carter came here looking for work, Justin called back. She's here of her own free will. That's what they all say, Benjamin replied. Why don't you let her speak for herself? Justin looked at Michelle, his expression tortured. She could see the impossible choice he was facing. If she spoke, it might prove his innocence, but it would also confirm her presence and make her a target. If she remained silent, it would only fuel their suspicions. It's all right, she whispered. I'll talk to them. No, Justin said firmly, but you don't understand what kind of men these are. If they think you're here against your will, they'll use that as an excuse to do whatever they want. But Michelle was already moving toward the door. She had spent too much of her life letting other people make decisions for her, letting fear dictate her choices. This time would be different. My name is Michelle Carter, she called through the door, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. I came here voluntarily, looking for work and shelter. Mr. Gonzalez has treated me with nothing but respect and kindness. The silence that followed was ominous. Then Benjamin's voice came back, heavy with suspicion. How do we know he's not making you say that? How do we know you're not afraid for your life? Because I'm telling you the truth, Michelle replied firmly. I'm here because I chose to be here. Then come outside and prove it, Christopher called. Come out where we can see you. Justin grabbed her arm as she reached for the door latch. Don't. Once you're outside, I can't protect you. And if I don't go, they'll assume you're holding me prisoner. Michelle met his eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. This is the only way. Michelle, please. You don't know what they're capable of. I know what you're capable of, she replied softly, and I trust you to keep me safe. Before he could stop her, she lifted the latch and stepped out into the frigid night air. 4 men stood in a rough semicircle around the cabin, their faces hard with suspicion and something darker. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, she could see they were all armed, rifles and pistols gleaming in their hands. There she is, Benjamin said, stepping forward. He was a large man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors. You all right, ma'am? He hurt you in any way? No, Michelle said firmly. Mr. Gonzalez has been nothing but a gentleman. Then why are you up here? Christopher asked. He was younger than Benjamin, with the kind of lean build that spoke of hard work and harder living. What kind of woman comes to a place like this alone? A desperate one, Michelle replied honestly. I lost my farm, my husband. I had nowhere else to go. So you came to him, Benjamin said, his tone suggesting something unsavory. Mighty convenient, don't you think? Man with his reputation, woman with nowhere to turn. Michelle felt anger flare in her chest. His reputation is based on lies and you know it. The only thing convenient about this arrangement is that it's kept me from freezing to death. Maybe, the third man said, speaking for the first time. He was older than the others, with silver hair and cold eyes that reminded Michelle of a snake. Or maybe you're just saying what he told you to say. I'm saying what I choose to say, Michelle snapped. I'm a grown woman, capable of making my own decisions. Are you? Benjamin stepped closer and Michelle could smell whiskey on his breath. Because it seems to me like you're in a pretty vulnerable position up here. All alone with a man who's already proven he can't be trusted around women. That's enough, Justin's voice came from the doorway, and Michelle turned to see him standing there with the rifle in his hands. You've heard what she has to say, now get off my land. Your land? Christopher laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. This is public land, Gonzalez. You don't own anything up here. I own this cabin, and I'm telling you to leave. We'll leave when we're ready, Benjamin said, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. Right now, we're conducting an investigation. Investigation into what? I haven't broken any laws. Haven't you? The older man stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on Michelle. Seems to me like you're living in sin with this woman. That's against the law in some places. Michelle felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. We're not living in sin. We have separate sleeping arrangements. Do you now? Benjamin's smile was ugly. Hard to believe, considering there's only one room in that cabin. Believe what you want, Justin said, his voice deadly quiet. But you're not welcome here, and you need to leave. Now. Or what? Christopher asked, raising his own rifle. You'll shoot us? That would just prove what we've been saying all along. The tension in the air was explosive. 4 armed men facing one, with Michelle caught in the middle. She could see that the situation was spiraling toward violence, and she knew that if shooting started, someone was going to die. Please, she said, stepping between Justin and the other men, this doesn't have to end badly. We're all reasonable people. Are we? Benjamin asked, his eyes never leaving Justin. Because I'm starting to think the only reasonable thing is to take this man back to town for a proper trial. On what charges? Michelle demanded. Kidnapping for starters, corrupting the morals of a decent woman. Benjamin's smile was cruel. I'm sure we can think of others. Michelle realized with growing horror that these men hadn't come here for justice. They had come looking for an excuse to hurt Justin, and her presence had only given them more ammunition. Whatever happened next, it wasn't going to end with them simply walking away. You're making a mistake, she said desperately. All of you. Mr. Gonzalez is a good man who's done nothing wrong. That's for a jury to decide, the older man said. If he's innocent, like you say, he's got nothing to worry about. But Michelle could see in their faces that they had no intention of letting Justin live long enough to see it over. This was a lynching party, dressed up in the language of justice but driven by something much darker. Run, Justin said quietly, his voice carrying just to her ears. Take the back way and run. I'm not leaving you. You have to. This isn't going to end well, and I won't have your death on my conscience. Before Michelle could respond, Benjamin made his move, stepping forward with his hand on his gun. Enough talking, you're coming with us, Gonzalez, one way or another. That's when everything went wrong at once. Justin's rifle came up in one fluid motion as Benjamin's hand closed on his pistol grip. But Christopher was faster, his weapon already aimed and ready. The crack of the gunshot split the frigid air like thunder, echoing off the surrounding peaks in a series of diminishing reports that seemed to go on forever. Michelle screamed as she saw Justin stagger backward, a dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. But even wounded, he kept his rifle trained on the men surrounding them, his face a mask of controlled fury and pain. Drop it, Gonzalez, Benjamin snarled, his own pistol now drawn and aimed at Justin's chest. Next one goes through your heart. You made a mistake coming here, Justin said through gritted teeth, blood seeping between the fingers he pressed against his wounded shoulder. This is my land, and I have every right to defend it. Your land? The older man, who Michelle now realized must be Andrew Gonzalez, stepped forward with the cold confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. You're nothing but a squatter up here, boy, and now you're a wounded squatter who's about to face justice. Michelle felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce despite the killing cold. These men had come here with violence already in their hearts, looking for any excuse to hurt Justin, and now they had drawn first blood. Whatever happened next, she would not stand by and watch them destroy the man who had saved her life. He's bleeding, she said, taking a step toward Justin. He needs medical attention. He needs a rope, Christopher spat, but there was something uncertain in his voice now, as if the reality of what they had done was beginning to penetrate his anger. Stay where you are, ma'am, Benjamin ordered, swinging his pistol toward Michelle. We'll tend to his wounds after we get some answers. What answers? Michelle demanded. What exactly do you think he's done? We know what he did in Denver, Andrew said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Seduced a student, tried to force himself on her when she refused his advances. Had to run before they could arrest him. That's a lie, Justin said, his voice steady despite the pain etched in his features. Sarah Morrison was troubled, failing my class. When I tried to help her, she misinterpreted my intentions and made accusations to cover her own inadequacies. So you say, Benjamin replied, but a man's word don't mean much when he's hiding out on a mountain with another man's widow. The implication in his tone made Michelle's skin crawl, but it also crystallized something that had been building inside her throughout this confrontation. These men saw her as nothing more than a victim or a possession, someone without agency or the ability to make her own choices. It was the same dismissive attitude she had endured from creditors and neighbors after her husband's death. The assumption that a woman alone was inherently vulnerable and in need of male protection or control. "I am not another man's anything," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am my own person, capable of making my own decisions, and I chose to be here." "Did you?" Andrew asked, his cold eyes studying her face. "Or did you just choose the lesser of two evils? Starvation in town? Or whatever this man demanded in exchange for shelter?" The question hit closer to home than Michelle cared to admit, but it also revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that drove these men's actions. They could not conceive of a relationship between a man and woman that was not based on exploitation or transaction, could not imagine that two people might find something genuine and valuable in each other's company. What he demanded, Michelle said clearly, was honest work in exchange for food and shelter. Nothing more, nothing less. "And you expect us to believe that?" Christopher laughed harshly. "A man living alone up here for 8 years suddenly takes in a woman out of the goodness of his heart?" "Believe what you want," Justin said, his voice growing weaker as blood continued to seep from his wound. "But you're trespassing on my property, and you've committed assault with a deadly weapon. If any of you have sense left, you'll leave now before this gets worse." "Worse for who?" Benjamin stepped closer, emboldened by Justin's obvious weakness. "You're in no position to make threats, teacher." Michelle saw the situation spiraling toward a conclusion that would end with Justin's death and possibly her own. These men had come too far and committed too much to simply walk away now. They would finish what they started, then claim they were acting in defense of her honor or the community's safety. But as she watched Justin struggle to stay upright, his face growing pale from blood loss, something shifted inside her. The frightened, desperate woman who had climbed this mountain weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. She had found strength in the wilderness and in her partnership with this man, and she would not let that be taken from her by the small-minded cruelty of men who understood neither. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "The truth is that Justin Gonzalez is twice the man any of you will ever be. He took me in when I had nowhere else to go, treated me with respect, when the rest of the world saw me as nothing but a burden, and never asked for anything in return except honest work." "Pretty words," Andrew said dismissively, "but words don't change facts." "No, they don't," Michelle agreed. "And the fact is that you came up here looking for an excuse to hurt an innocent man. And when you couldn't find one, you decided to create one." She moved closer to Justin, positioning herself between him and the armed men. "The fact is that you're all cowards, hiding behind rumors and lies because you're too small to face your own failures." "Michelle, don't," Justin warned, but she could hear the weakness in his voice, see the way he was struggling to maintain his grip on the rifle. "No," she said firmly. "I've spent too much of my life staying quiet while other people decided my fate. Not anymore." Benjamin's face darkened with anger. "You think you're protecting him? You think your words mean anything against what we know he's done?" "I think you don't know anything except what you've chosen to believe," Michelle replied. "And I think you're about to make a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your lives." "The only mistake," Christopher said, raising his rifle again, "was letting this go on as long as we have." But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the tension, coming from the darkness beyond the circle of armed men. "That's enough." Everyone turned toward the sound, and Michelle felt her heart leap as she saw a figure emerging from the tree line, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. The newcomer was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors, but there was an authority in his bearing that made even Benjamin step back. "Sheriff Martinez," Andrew said, his voice tight with surprise. "What are you doing up here?" "Following reports of armed men heading up the mountain in the middle of winter," the sheriff replied, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Seemed like the kind of thing that might require official attention." Michelle felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the realization that the sheriff's presence might not change anything fundamental about their situation. If he believed the accusations against Justin, He might simply provide official sanction for what these men intended to do. Sheriff, Benjamin said, his tone taking on the false reasonableness of someone trying to justify questionable actions. We're conducting a citizen's investigation into serious allegations against this man. Are you now? Sheriff Martinez looked around the scene, taking in the armed men, Justin's bleeding wound, and Michelle's defensive posture. And what allegations would those be? Corruption of a minor in Denver, kidnapping, living in sin, Andrew rattled off. We have it on good authority that he fled Colorado to avoid prosecution. Good authority, the sheriff repeated thoughtfully. Would that be the same good authority that told you he was holding Mrs. Carter against her will? The question hung in the air, and Michelle saw uncertainty flicker across several faces. The sheriff's tone suggested he knew more about the situation than the vigilantes had expected. Mrs. Carter, Sheriff Martinez continued, addressing Michelle directly, are you here against your will? No, sir, Michelle replied firmly. I came here seeking work and shelter. And Mr. Gonzalez provided both in exchange for honest labor. And has he mistreated you in any way? Quite the opposite. He's treated me with nothing but respect and kindness. The sheriff nodded, then turned his attention to Justin's wound. That looks like it needs attention. Who fired that shot? The silence that followed was telling. Christopher shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak up. I see, Sheriff Martinez said dryly. Well, gentlemen, it seems we have a situation here. An unarmed man has been shot on his own property by a group of vigilantes acting without legal authority. Now, wait a minute, Benjamin protested. We had good reason to believe. You had rumors and suspicion, the sheriff cut him off, which last I checked, don't constitute legal grounds for armed assault. Michelle watched the dynamic shift as the sheriff's presence changed the balance of power. The men who had seemed so confident in their righteousness now looked uncertain, faced with the reality that their actions might have legal consequences. Sheriff, Andrew said, trying to regain control of the narrative, surely you're not going to take the word of a man who fled prosecution in Denver. I'm going to take the word of the Denver Police Department, Sheriff Martinez replied calmly, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. I sent a telegram asking about Mr. Gonzalez's legal status. Turns out the charges against him were dropped when the accuser recanted her story and admitted she had fabricated the allegations. The revelation hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Michelle saw the certainty drain from their faces, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they had acted on false information. That's impossible, Christopher said weakly. You heard rumors, the sheriff said firmly. Rumors that have now been proven false by official documentation. Justin swayed on his feet, the blood loss and shock beginning to take their toll. Michelle moved to support him, helping him lean against the cabin wall while keeping pressure on his wound. He needs medical attention, she said urgently. Yes, he does, Sheriff Martinez agreed. Which brings us to the question of what happens next. The sheriff's gaze moved from man to man, studying each face in the moonlight. You gentlemen came up here armed, trespassed on private property, and shot an innocent man based on false accusations. That's assault with a deadly weapon, criminal trespass, and vigilantism. We thought we were doing the right thing, Benjamin said, but his voice lacked conviction. The road to hell, the sheriff replied, is paved with good intentions. The question now is whether we handle this officially, with arrests and trials, or whether we can find another way to resolve the situation. Michelle understood the implicit bargain being offered. The men could face the full legal consequences of their actions, or they could accept some alternative form of justice that would allow everyone to save face. What kind of alternative? Andrew asked carefully. The kind where you help get Mr. Gonzalez down the mountain for medical treatment, make restitution for the damage you've caused, and spread the word in town that the accusations against him were false. The sheriff's tone made it clear this was not a negotiation. In exchange, he might be willing not to press charges. Justin looked up from where he leaned against the cabin wall, his face pale, but his eyes still sharp. I want them gone from my land. All of them. And I want it known in town that Mrs. Carter is here of her own free will, working for honest wages. That seems reasonable, Sheriff Martinez said. Gentlemen, The four men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. The alternative to accepting the sheriff's proposal was arrest, trial, and likely imprisonment. The choice was not difficult to make. "We accept," Benjamin said finally, speaking for the group. "Good," the sheriff said. "Now let's get Mr. Gonzalez the medical attention he needs." The next hour was a blur of activity as the men who had come to hurt Justin instead found themselves helping to save his life. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and blankets, carefully moved him from the cabin to begin the dangerous journey down the mountain in darkness. Michelle packed quickly, gathering the few possessions she had brought to the mountain, along with some of Justin's belongings. As she worked, she found herself thinking about what would happen next, where they would go, what their relationship would become once they were back in the world of other people and social expectations. "Mrs. Carter," Sheriff Martinez said, appearing in the cabin doorway. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I can be," she replied, shouldering her small pack. "There's something I want you to know," the sheriff said quietly. "What you did tonight, standing up to those men, protecting Mr. Gonzalez even when it put you in danger, that took real courage." Michelle felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I did what anyone would do." "No," the sheriff said firmly. "You did what a strong person does. There's a difference." As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been her home for the past weeks, Michelle took one last look around the space where she had discovered parts of herself she never knew existed. The fire was banked, but still glowing. The books still lined the shelves. The simple furniture still spoke of craftsmanship and care. But it was more than just a physical space she was leaving behind. It was the place where she had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, more capable than anyone had ever told her. The journey down the mountain was treacherous in the darkness, made more dangerous by the need to carry an injured man over terrain that was challenging even in daylight. But the men who had come as enemies now worked together with grim determination, united by the shared goal of getting Justin to safety. Michelle walked beside the makeshift stretcher, monitoring Justin's condition and offering what comfort she could. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his face pale in the moonlight, but his breathing remained steady and his pulse strong. "How much farther?" she asked Sheriff Martinez during one of their brief rests. "Another mile to where I left my horses," he replied. "From there, it's a hard ride to town, but we should make it before dawn." The horses were sturdy mountain animals, accustomed to difficult terrain and harsh weather. They rigged a travois behind one of them to carry Justin, while Michelle rode behind the sheriff on his mount. The other men would have to walk, their own horses having been left lower on the mountain. As they descended through the darkness, Michelle found herself thinking about the accusations that had nearly cost Justin his life. The young woman in Denver who had fabricated her story, the rumors that had spread and grown in the telling, the men who had been so ready to believe the worst about someone they barely knew. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly a person's life could be destroyed by lies and the willingness of others to believe them. "Sheriff," she said quietly as they rode, "what will happen to those men?" "Depends on Mr. Gonzalez," he replied. "If he decides to press charges, they'll face trial. If not, they'll have to live with what they did and hope the community forgives them for acting like fools." "And Justin, will people believe the truth about what happened in Denver?" "Some will, some won't. That's the way of things. But at least now there's official documentation of his innocence. That should count for something." They reached the town just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to show over the eastern peaks. The doctor was roused from his bed to tend to Justin's wound, which proved to be serious but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels, and with proper care he would make a full recovery. As Justin was being treated, Michelle found herself in the uncomfortable position of being the center of attention and speculation. Word of the night's events spread quickly through the small community, and she could feel the weight of curious and judgmental stares wherever she went. "Mrs. Carter," a woman's voice called out as Michelle sat in the doctor's waiting area. She turned to see a well-dressed lady in her 40s approaching with the kind of determined expression that usually preceded unwelcome advice. "Yes?" "I'm Mrs. Julie Perez, president of the Ladies' Auxiliary. I wanted to speak with you about your situation." Michelle felt her defenses rise. "What about my situation?" "Well, it's quite irregular, isn't it? A unmarried woman living alone with a man, regardless of the circumstances. Mrs. Perez's tone was carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than condemning, but Michelle heard the judgment beneath it. The circumstances, Michelle said evenly, were that I needed shelter and work, and Mr. Gonzalez provided both in exchange for honest labor. I'm sure that's true, dear, but you must understand how it appears to others. There are proprieties to consider, reputations to protect. Michelle felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, the same rage that had driven her to stand up to the armed men on the mountain. Whose reputation? Mine or the town's? Both, I should think. We'd like to offer you a position with one of our member families. Respectable work, proper supervision, a chance to rebuild your life in a more appropriate manner. The offer was probably well-intentioned, but Michelle heard in it the same assumption that had driven the vigilantes to the mountain. The belief that she was incapable of making her own decisions, that she needed to be managed and protected by others who knew better than she did what was best for her life. That's very kind, Michelle said carefully, but I already have employment. With Mr. Gonzalez? But surely after what's happened, that arrangement can't continue. Why not? Mrs. Perez looked flustered, as if the question itself was improper. Well, because it wouldn't be right. People would talk. People are already talking, Michelle pointed out. They talked when I lost my farm. They talked when I couldn't find work in town, and they'll talk no matter what I do next. The question is whether I live my life according to their opinions or according to my own judgment. Before Mrs. Perez could respond, the doctor emerged from his treatment room with news about Justin's condition. The wound is clean and should heal well with proper care, Dr. Jeremy Chavez announced. He'll need rest and someone to change the bandages regularly, but there's no reason he can't recover fully. Thank you, doctor, Michelle said, relief flooding through her. He's asking for you, Dr. Chavez added. You can see him now. Michelle found Justin propped up in the doctor's bed, his left arm in a sling, but his color much improved. When he saw her, something that might have been relief flickered across his features. How are you feeling? She asked, taking the chair beside his bed. Like I've been shot, he replied with a weak attempt at humor. But alive, thanks to you. Thanks to Sheriff Martinez and his timing. No, Justin said firmly. Thanks to you standing up to those men when they could have killed us both. That took more courage than I had any right to expect. Michelle felt heat rise in her cheeks. I did what needed to be done. You did what a strong person does, Justin said, echoing the sheriff's earlier words. The question now is, what happens next? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had fully explored. Their arrangement on the mountain had been born of necessity, but it had evolved into something deeper and more complex. Now, back in the world of social expectations and conventional morality, they would have to decide what their relationship meant and where it could go. Mrs. Perez offered me a position with a respectable family, Michelle said. Something flickered in Justin's expression. Are you going to take it? That depends. On what? Michelle met his eyes directly. On whether you still need someone to help with the animals and the household work. Michelle, Justin said carefully, you understand what people will say if you come back to the mountain with me. The talk, the assumptions, the judgment. I understand that people will always find something to criticize, Michelle replied. The question is whether I care more about their opinions than about living the life I choose. Justin studied her face in the morning light filtering through the doctor's window. And what life do you choose? It was the question she had been asking herself since the moment she had knocked on his cabin door, the question that had become more urgent with each passing day of their shared isolation. What did she want? What kind of life could she build from the ashes of her old existence? I choose a life where I'm valued for my work and my character, not pitied for my circumstances, she said slowly. I choose a life where I'm treated as an equal partner, not as someone who needs to be managed or protected. I choose a life where I can be strong without being judged for it. That's a hard life to find in most places, but not impossible to find in some places. Justin was quiet for a long moment, and Michelle could see him weighing her words against his own desires and fears. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "If you come back to the mountain with me, it won't be as my employee." Michelle felt her heart skip. What would it be as? As my partner, in the work, in the decisions, in whatever we build together. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. And eventually, if you are willing, as my wife. The proposal hung in the air between them, simple and profound in its implications. Michelle felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone saw her as she had always wanted to be seen, as a complete person worthy of partnership and love. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to which part?" "Yes to all of it." Justin's smile was like sunrise after a long night, transforming his face and filling the small room with warmth. He reached out with his good hand, and Michelle took it, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had helped her survive the winter. "There will be talk," he warned. "There's already talk. There will be people who disapprove. There are already people who disapprove. There will be challenges, hardships, times when you wonder if you made the right choice." Michelle squeezed his hand. "There will also be mornings when we watch the sunrise over the peaks, evenings by the fire reading poetry, the satisfaction of work well done, and a life built together. I'll take the challenges if I can have the rest." Dr. Chavez appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt, but there are several people outside who would like to speak with both of you." Michelle and Justin exchanged glances, understanding that the easy part of their decision was over. Now they would have to face the community's reaction to their choice, defend their right to live as they saw fit, and prove that their relationship was based on genuine affection and respect rather than mere convenience. "We'll face them together," Justin said, struggling to sit up straighter. "Together," Michelle agreed. The group waiting outside the doctor's office was larger than Michelle had expected. Along with Mrs. Perez and the ladies' auxiliary, there were several men from the town council, some of the vigilantes from the night before looking distinctly uncomfortable, and a scattering of curious townspeople drawn by the drama of the situation. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward as they emerged. "Mr. Gonzalez, Mrs. Carter, I trust you're feeling better?" "Much, thank you," Justin replied. "Good, because there are some people here who owe you an apology, and some decisions to be made about how we move forward." Benjamin Rivera stepped forward, his hat in his hands and his expression genuinely contrite. "Mr. Gonzalez, I want to apologize for what happened last night. We acted on bad information and let our prejudices cloud our judgment. There's no excuse for what we did." "No, there isn't," Justin agreed. "But apologies are a start." Christopher Kelly nodded his agreement. "We'll make sure everyone in town knows the truth about what happened in Denver and about Mrs. Carter's situation. You have our word on that." "And what about restitution?" Sheriff Martinez asked pointedly. "We'll cover the doctor's bills," Andrew Gonzalez said, "and any other expenses related to the injury." "That's acceptable," Justin said, "but I want something else as well." "What's that?" "I want it understood that Mrs. Carter and I are planning to marry, and that anyone who has a problem with that arrangement can take it up with me directly." The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the gathered crowd. Michelle saw a range of reactions, from genuine pleasure to obvious disapproval, but she kept her chin up and her expression calm. Mrs. Perez was the first to speak. "Well, that does change things, doesn't it? Congratulations to you both." "Thank you," Michelle replied, noting the careful neutrality in the woman's tone. "When is the wedding to take place?" someone called from the crowd. Justin looked at Michelle and she saw the question in his eyes. They hadn't discussed timing, had barely had time to process their mutual decision. "As soon as Mr. Gonzalez is recovered enough to travel," Michelle said. "We'll have the ceremony in town, so everyone can see that our union is proper and legal." "And after that?" Mrs. Perez asked. "After that, we'll return to the mountain and continue building the life we've started there," Justin said firmly. The crowd began to disperse, some people offering congratulations, others simply walking away with expressions that suggested they were still processing the news. Michelle found herself surrounded by a small group of women offering advice about wedding preparations and expressing curiosity about her plans. As the immediate excitement died down, Sheriff Martinez approached them with a more serious expression. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said quietly. "The avalanche that blocked your way down the mountain, it's going to take weeks to clear. Maybe months." Michelle felt her stomach drop. "What does that mean?" "It means that if you're planning to return to the mountain after the wedding, you'll be cut off again until spring. No way in or out until the snow melts and we can clear the debris." Justin and Michelle exchanged glances, understanding the implications. They would be isolated again, dependent on each other and their stored supplies to survive until the route reopened. "That doesn't change anything," Justin said firmly. "It's our home." "Are you sure?" the sheriff asked, looking at Michelle. "It's a hard life up there, especially for a woman. No neighbors, no help if something goes wrong, no way out if you change your mind." Michelle thought about the cabin, about the animals they had sheltered in the root cellar, about the stacks of split wood and the books on the shelves. She thought about the mornings spent working together in comfortable silence, the evenings by the fire sharing stories and dreams, the sense of partnership and purpose she had found in that isolated place. "I'm sure," she said. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the town's small church, with most of the community in attendance despite the lingering controversy surrounding their relationship. Michelle wore a simple blue dress borrowed from one of the more sympathetic ladies in town, while Justin, his arms still in a sling, stood beside her in his best suit. The ceremony itself was brief and dignified, conducted by a minister who had known Justin during his early years on the mountain and had no doubt about his character. When they exchanged vows, Michelle felt the weight of the commitment they were making, not just to each other, but to the life they had chosen to build together. "Do you, Michelle Carter, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Michelle said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Justin Gonzalez, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Justin replied, his eyes never leaving Michelle's face. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The kiss was gentle and brief, appropriate for the public setting, but Michelle felt in it the promise of deeper intimacy and connection to come. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, she saw a mixture of approval, curiosity, and lingering skepticism in the faces before them. The reception was held in the church hall, with food provided by the ladies' auxiliary and music supplied by a local fiddle player. Michelle found herself the center of attention in a way that felt both overwhelming and oddly liberating. For the first time in her adult life, she was being celebrated rather than pitied, recognized for making a positive choice rather than criticized for her circumstances. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Dr. Chavez said, approaching with his wife Karen at his side, "I wanted to wish you both happiness and to give you some supplies for the mountain." He handed her a carefully packed medical kit. Bandages, medicines, basic surgical supplies. "Living as isolated as you'll be, it's important to be prepared for medical emergencies." "Thank you," Michelle said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "This is very kind." "It's practical," Dr. Chavez replied, "and I hope you'll never need to use most of it." As the evening wore on, Michelle found herself in conversation with Donna Long, one of the few women in town who had offered genuine friendship rather than judgment. "Are you nervous about going back up there?" Donna asked. "Being cut off from everyone for months?" Michelle considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted. "But not about being with Justin. If anything, I'm looking forward to having time to settle into our marriage without the whole town watching and commenting." "That makes sense," Donna said. "And you'll have plenty to keep you busy, running a household, tending animals, all that work." "It's good work," Michelle replied. "Meaningful work. I've never felt more useful or valued than I have these past months." "Even with all the hardship?" "Especially with the hardship. It's shown me what I'm capable of, what we're capable of together." As the celebration wound down, Michelle and Justin prepared to spend their wedding night in the town's small hotel before beginning the journey back to the mountain. The proprietor, a kindly woman named Mrs. Ross, had decorated their room with wildflowers and provided a bottle of wine to mark the occasion. Alone together for the first time as husband and wife, they stood somewhat awkwardly in the small room, suddenly aware of the changed nature of their relationship. "No regrets?" Justin asked, settling carefully into a chair to avoid jarring his healing shoulder. "None," Michelle replied firmly. "You?" "Only that it took a group of armed men to make me realize what I'd be losing if I let you walk away." Michelle moved to stand beside his chair, running her fingers gently through his hair. "You wouldn't have lost me. I was never planning to leave. Even before tonight? Before we made it official?" "Especially before tonight. I'd already made my choice, Justin. The ceremony just made it legal." He reached up with his good hand to cover hers. "I love you, Michelle Gonzalez." The sound of her new name sent warmth flooding through her. "I love you too." They spent their wedding night talking quietly and holding each other, both understanding that their physical relationship would develop naturally in its own time. For now, it was enough to be together, to know that they had chosen each other freely and completely. The next morning brought the beginning of their journey back to the mountain, a trip that would take them through terrain made treacherous by winter weather and the recent avalanche. Sheriff Martinez had arranged for a pack train to carry supplies that would see them through the remaining months of isolation, along with wedding gifts from various townspeople. As they rode up the familiar trail, Michelle felt a sense of homecoming that surprised her with its intensity. The mountain that had once seemed hostile and forbidding now felt like sanctuary, a place where she could be her truest self without apology or explanation. "Look," Justin said, pointing ahead to where smoke was rising from their cabin's chimney. "Did we leave the fire burning?" Michelle asked, then realized the impossibility of that after 2 weeks away. They approached cautiously, but their concern turned to amazement when they discovered that several of the men from town, led by Christopher Kelly, had spent the past week preparing the cabin for their return. The fire was laid, supplies were stocked, and the animals had been cared for in their absence. "Consider it part of our apology," Christopher said when they found him tending the goats, "and our wedding gift." "This is incredible," Michelle said, looking around at the preparations that had been made. "Thank you. Least we could do after what we put you through," Christopher replied. "Besides, it felt good to do something constructive for a change." After the men from town departed, Michelle and Justin found themselves alone in their mountain home for the first time as a married couple. The cabin felt different somehow, charged with new possibilities and the promise of the life they would build together. "It's really ours now," Michelle said, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table where they had shared so many meals. "It always was," Justin replied, "from the moment you decided to stay." They settled into a routine that was familiar yet transformed by their new relationship. The daily chores remained the same, but they were now shared labors in the truest sense. Contributions to a life they were building together rather than simply survival tasks. Michelle found herself taking on more of the decision-making, her opinions sought and valued on everything from which trees to cut for firewood to how to arrange the furniture for maximum efficiency. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher around their cabin, they discovered the pleasures of married life in isolation. Evenings by the fire became opportunities for deeper conversation and growing intimacy. They read to each other from Justin's collection of books, shared stories from their past lives, and made plans for the future they would create together. "I want to expand the garden come spring," Michelle said one evening as they sat before the fire. "Maybe add some fruit trees if we can get them to survive at this altitude." "That's a good idea," Justin agreed. "We could also think about adding another room to the cabin, a proper bedroom, maybe a larger kitchen." "Planning to stay here permanently, are we, Fran?" Michelle teased. "Aren't you?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes, I think I am. This place has become more home to me than anywhere I've ever lived. Even with all the hardships, the isolation, the harsh winters, the constant work, especially because of those things. They've shown me who I really am, what I'm capable of. I don't want to go back to being the person I was before I came here." Justin reached over to take her hand. "You could never go back to being that person. You've grown too much, become too strong." As the weeks passed, Michelle found herself thinking often about the woman who had climbed this mountain months ago. desperate and frightened and convinced she had no options left. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known once but could barely recognize. In her place was someone harder and more confident, someone who had learned that strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head on. The physical intimacy of their marriage developed gradually and naturally, growing from the emotional connection they had built during their months of shared hardship. Michelle discovered that the trust she had learned to place in Justin as a partner in survival extended seamlessly into trust in him as a husband and lover. Their relationship was built on equality and mutual respect, qualities that made their physical connection deeper and more satisfying than anything she had experienced in her first marriage. "I never knew it could be like this," she confided to him one night as they lay together in the warmth of their shared bed. "Like what?" "Partnership, real partnership, where both people are valued equally. It's the only way I know how to love someone," Justin replied, stroking her hair in the firelight. "My parents had that kind of marriage. I always knew I wouldn't settle for less." "Is that why you never married before? Because you couldn't find someone who wanted that kind of partnership?" "Partly, and partly because I was too focused on my career, too convinced that I could find fulfillment in work alone." He was quiet for a moment. "What about you? Was your first marriage different?" Michelle considered how to answer honestly without being disloyal to her late husband's memory. "David was a good man in many ways, but he saw marriage as traditional roles rather than partnership. I was supposed to support his decisions, not make my own." "That must have been difficult." "I thought it was normal. I didn't know there was any other way until I came here and discovered what it felt like to have my opinions valued and my abilities respected." As spring began to show its first tentative signs, with longer days and the occasional sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves, Michelle and Justin began to plan for the future in more concrete terms. They would remain on the mountain, but they would also maintain connections with the town below, perhaps spending part of each year in both places. "I've been thinking about teaching again," Justin said one morning as they worked together to repair winter damage to the animal shelters. "Here on the mountain? In town. Maybe just part-time. There are children there who could benefit from education, and I think I'm ready to face that part of my life again." Michelle felt a surge of pride in his decision. "I think that's wonderful. You're too good a teacher to let false accusations keep you from sharing your knowledge. What about you? Any thoughts about what you'd like to do?" Michelle paused in her work, considering the question. "I'd like to help other women who find themselves in situations like mine was, women who've lost everything and don't know where to turn." "How would you do that?" "I'm not sure yet. Maybe work with the ladies' auxiliary, maybe start something new. But I know there are women out there who need to learn what I learned up here." "Which is?" "That they're stronger than they think they are, that they don't have to accept other people's definitions of what their lives should be." Michelle straightened, looking out over the valley that had become her home, that sometimes losing everything is the first step to finding yourself. The avalanche that had trapped them on the mountain finally cleared in late April, opening the route to town for the first time in months. Their first visitors were Sheriff Martinez and Dr. Chavez, who came to check on their welfare and bring news from the outside world. "You both look well," Dr. Chavez observed, examining Justin's shoulder and pronouncing it fully healed. "Mountain life agrees with you." "It does," Michelle replied. "We're happier than I ever imagined possible." "And the isolation didn't drive you crazy?" Sheriff Martinez asked with a grin. "Quite the opposite," Justin said. "It gave us time to really get to know each other without outside interference." "Well, you'll be getting some outside interference soon enough," the sheriff said. "Word of your story has spread beyond the local area. There's a newspaper reporter from Denver who wants to interview you about surviving the winter and the avalanche." Michelle felt a flutter of anxiety. What kind of story does he want to write? Human interest piece, from what I understand. Mountain romance, triumph over adversity, that sort of thing. "We're not interested in being anyone's entertainment," Justin said firmly. "That's your choice, of course. But it might be good for people to hear the truth about what happened up here, especially given all the rumors that were floating around." Michelle and Justin exchanged glances, weighing the potential benefits against their desire for privacy. "We'll think about it," Michelle said finally. As summer arrived in full force, bringing warmth and the explosion of wildflowers that transformed the mountain landscape, Michelle found herself reflecting on the year that had passed since she first climbed the trail to Justin's cabin. The desperate, frightened woman who had made that journey seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone she had been but could no longer imagine being. They did eventually agree to the newspaper interview, seeing it as an opportunity to set the record straight about the events that had brought them together and to perhaps inspire other people facing seemingly impossible circumstances. The reporter, a young man named Thomas Wright, spent several days with them on the mountain, documenting their daily routine and the story of their courtship and marriage. "What would you want people to take away from your story?" he asked during one of their conversations. Michelle considered the question carefully. That strength isn't something you either have or don't have. It's something you develop by facing challenges and refusing to give up. And that love can be found in the most unexpected places, Justin added, if you're open to recognizing it when it appears. The article, when it was published, portrayed them as heroes of a sort, people who had overcome adversity through courage and determination. While Michelle was uncomfortable with the romanticized version of their story, she was pleased that it might encourage other people facing difficult circumstances. More importantly, their article helped to finally put to rest the rumors and speculation that had surrounded Justin's departure from Denver and their relationship. The official documentation of his innocence, combined with the positive portrayal of their marriage, which went a long way toward restoring his reputation and establishing their place in the community. As their first wedding anniversary approached, Michelle found herself thinking about the vows they had exchanged and how much deeper their meaning had become through lived experience. They had indeed faced sickness and health, richer and poorer, better and worse, and each challenge had strengthened rather than weakened their bond. "Do you ever regret it?" Justin asked one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Giving up the possibility of an easier life for this one. Michelle reached over to take his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that had helped build the life they shared. "Never," she said firmly. "This is the life I was meant to live, with the person I was meant to love. Everything that happened before, all the loss and struggle and desperation, it was all leading me here, to you and to this place where I could become who I was always supposed to be." "And who is that?" Michelle smiled, watching the last light fade from the peaks that had become her sanctuary and her home. "Someone strong enough to choose her own path, brave enough to face whatever challenges come, and wise enough to recognize love when it finds her in the most unexpected places." As if summoned by her words, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, tiny points of light that had guided travelers for countless generations. Michelle squeezed Justin's hand, feeling the solid reality of their partnership and the endless possibilities that stretched before them like the vast mountain wilderness they called home. They had found each other in desperation and isolation, but they had built something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of necessity and mutual respect. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Two people who had learned that the strongest foundations are built not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared adversity. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and snow down from the peaks, a familiar perfume that spoke of home and belonging and the endless cycle of seasons that would mark the years of their life together. Michelle breathed it in deeply, knowing that she had finally found the place where she belonged and the person she was meant to be. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing off the granite walls of their mountain sanctuary. It was a wild song, full of freedom and fierce joy, and as Michelle listened to it fade into the night, she understood that it was also her song, the song of someone who had learned to choose strength over safety, love over security, an authentic partnership over conventional expectations. She was Michelle Gonzalez now, wife and partner and mountain woman, someone who had discovered that the most beautiful lives are often built in the most unlikely places by people brave enough to trust in each other and in their own capacity for growth and change. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, she knew that this was only the beginning of the story she and Justin would write together in the years to come.